Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about NATO. Donald Trump, in a recent rally, made a statement saying that when he was president, he spoke to NATO and threatened any member that wasn't paying its dues that it wouldn't have any support from NATO in the event that they were invaded by Russia or any other aggressive counterparty. And this apparently sent shockwaves through NATO, and at that point in time, a variety of countries hadn't actually been keeping up with their obligations. So in today's video, I'll have a look at exactly what Donald Trump said. We'll then talk about NATO itself and how much it actually costs to keep the alliance going, because NATO is an alliance of 31 countries, and although it doesn't have any actual armed forces of its own, it relies upon all of the member countries actually contributing armed forces individually. It does have its headquarters and a variety of other cost bases that cost around $3 billion per year to run, and the member states have to contribute to that budget, and the percentages that each are paying are very different. So we'll have a look at exactly what the cost base of NATO is. We'll then have a look at how much each country is contributing. So we'll see how much the USA, the UK and other countries are actually obliged to pay. We'll then have a look at what the military obligations are for each of the member states, because they're required to invest a certain percentage of their GDP into defence spending, and also to be procuring a certain amount of equipment each year. So I'll have a look at how every nation is actually faring, whether or not they're keeping up with those obligations. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the implications of non-payment and not keeping up with your obligations are for NATO membership, and what this means in the event of one of the NATO members actually being invaded by Russia. If that was to occur at some point over the next 12 to 18 months, what would actually happen? But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. It really helps to keep the channel going.
NATO was busted until I came along. I said, everybody's going to pay. They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not. They couldn't believe the answer. And everybody, you never saw more money pour in to Secretary General Stoltenberg. Well, I don't know if he is anymore, but he was my biggest fan. He said, all these presidents came in, they'd make a speech, they'd leave, and that was it. And they all owed money, and they wouldn't pay it. I came in, I made a speech, and I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills. And the money came flowing in. Most politicians have said to that, yes, we will protect you under any circumstance. Well, then they're never paying up. I said, no, you have to understand, you don't pay your bills, you get no protection. It's very simple. Hundreds of billions of dollars came into NATO, and that's why they have money today, because of what I did.
This chart shows the NATO funding requirements in 2022, as detailed in the recent NATO annual report, which was published in March 2023. We haven't got the figures for 2023 itself yet, because they won't be published until March 24. So this is the latest data that we have. And what we've got here are three different categories of funding that NATO requires. The military budget, which is by far the largest of the three separate budgets that NATO operates, costs around $1.6 billion per year. The actual amount in 2022 was 1.46 billion euros. However, I've converted it into dollars because I think it's easier for most people to think in dollars, which is described by NATO as contributing to the strengthening of NATO's deterrence and defence posture, and fosters interoperability across the alliance. This cash funds the operating of selected common funding capabilities, the integrated command structure, alliance operations and missions, and to some extent training and exercises. It consists of 38 separate budgets which are financed with contributions from the Allied national defence budgets according to agreed cost share formulas. And I'll come on to talk about the agreed percentages in a moment. And this chart shows the breakdown of the military budget in 2022. And as you can see, by far the largest expenditure, representing 53%, was the NATO command structure, entities and programmes. So these are the things that NATO are organising. The second largest portion, representing 21%, was the NATO Airborne Early Warning and Control Force. The Alliance Ground Surveillance Force represented 11% of expenditure. 10% of the funds went on pensions for the employees of NATO, 3% on the NATO command structure adaptation, and 2% on alliance operations and missions. The second largest part of the NATO budget is the security investment budget, which in 2022 amounted to $869 billion. And this cash is used to fund major infrastructure and command and control systems. It provides installations and facilities such as air defence communication and information systems, military headquarters for the integrated command structure for NATO and for deployed operations, as well as critical airfield, fuel systems and land and maritime facilities. This chart shows the breakdown of the security investment programme in 2022, and as you can see, the largest portion of expenditure, representing 37%, was to provide logistical support and sustainment capability for deploying forces. 19% went on providing NATO-wide air command and control capabilities, 14% on providing deployable forces, 11% went on providing NATO-wide consultation, command and control capabilities, 7% went on providing training, exercise and education in support of operations and deployable forces, 6% on alliance operations and missions, 4% on maintaining deterrent posture, and 2% on maintaining the NATO command structure. And the third part of NATO's budget is the civil budget, which cost $261 million in 2022. And these funds cover the cost of the employees of NATO. And as you can see, 58% of the total budget went on direct personnel costs, 28% on operating and maintenance of their facilities, 11% on programmes, and 3% on capital. So if we now jump back to this chart, you can see that the total cost for NATO in 2022 was $2.7 billion. So basically that's how much it costs just to keep NATO running. And as part of the treaty agreement, all of the member states are obliged to make payments to cover those costs. And as you can see here, each country has a set percentage of the total amount that they need to pay. And if we look right at the top of this chart, you can see that the countries that contribute the most are the United States and Germany, both of which are paying 16.2%, which equated to $443 million in 2022. The next two largest contributors were the United Kingdom and France, contributing $306 million and $284 million respectively. Italy contributed $238 million, Canada $186 million, Spain $162 million, Turkey $128 million, and I won't run through the rest of this list because I'll get a lot of comments in the section below from people saying, why are you reading out lists when I'm perfectly capable of reading? And the reason that I do this, obviously, is because a lot of people are not watching the screen. I've mentioned this in previous videos before, but around a third of all of my viewers are actually listening as a podcast rather than watching the screen. So that's one of the reasons why I read it out, but I won't go through all of the different countries. But you can see that as we move down the list, the percentage that each of these countries is having to cover goes down significantly. And the 10 countries at the bottom, which are Croatia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Latvia, Estonia, Albania, North Macedonia, Iceland and Montenegro, are all paying less than $10 million each for their participation. And when you compare that to the United States and Germany, who are paying $443 million, you can see that there is a huge difference in terms of keeping up the costs of NATO membership. And this is one of the points that Donald Trump was making, that if you're only obliged to pay $1 or $2 or $3 million, you need to make sure that you're making those payments, otherwise your membership might be revoked. So we've just had a look at what the direct costs of NATO are. This is basically all of their admin costs for all of the people and the training programs and the exercises that NATO put together when they invite all of the different countries to get together and undertake practice exercises where they're simulating wars and things like that. However, in addition to covering NATO's admin costs, there are also other requirements for member nations whereby they have to commit to a certain amount of their GDP to be invested into defence spending to make sure that those nations have enough people and equipment in the event that some sort of war does start, and NATO countries are required to step up and provide people, personnel and equipment. And this chart shows the first requirement that all of the member nations have to commit to, and that is a guideline that member nations should be investing 2% of their total GDP into defence expenditure. The scale on the left hand side of this chart shows the percentage of each country's GDP that was invested into defence. And across the bottom, we've got all of the different countries. And we've got two different bars here. The light blue bar shows the position in 2014, which was the last time that NATO produced one of these reports. And the dark blue bar shows the position in 2022. And the red line across the middle of this chart shows the 2% NATO guideline. So that's basically where NATO wants everybody to be. And this chart shows us a variety of different things. The first thing that stands out is that there were only 7 countries that actually invested more than 2% of their GDP into defence in 2022. And those 7 countries were Greece, who invested 3.54%, the United States 3.46%, Lithuania 2.47%, Poland 2.42%, the United Kingdom 2.16%, Estonia 2.12%, and Latvia at 2.07%. Disappointingly, the other 27 nations all came in below the recommended 2% GDP level. Now, if we take a step back and look at the difference between the light blue bars and the dark blue bars, you can see that the vast majority of the NATO countries increased their spending on defence. In fact, the only countries that didn't see an increase in 2022 versus 2014 were the USA, where there was a slight fall, Turkey and Montenegro. And if we have a quick look at this chart, which shows the annual real change in defence expenditure for all of the NATO countries from 2012 to 2022, you can see that 2015 was the turning point. Following Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, when it annexed that area that was formerly part of Ukraine, investment into defence spending started to increase again after 3 years of declines. And you can see that 2017 was actually the peak year of increase when it went up by 5.9%. However, in every single one of the last 8 years, there has been a net increase in defence spending. However, despite that annual increase in expenditure, only 7 countries in the NATO alliance are above the recommended 2% of GDP guideline. The other recommendation that NATO has made to its member states is that out of its defence expenditure, it should be making at least 20% of that investment into equipment. So this is basically the hardware needed to support a war, such as planes, ships, guns, tanks and bullets. The scale on the left-hand side of this chart looks at the percentage of defence spending going into equipment and goes from 0% at the bottom to 50% at the top. And across the bottom, we've got all of the different countries. And once again, we've got the difference between 2014 and 2022, shown by the light blue bar and the dark blue bar. And what stands out about this chart is that over the last 8 years, there has been a huge increase in the amount of defence spending that is going directly into equipment. Now, the red line on this chart shows the 20% guideline for equipment expenditure. And unlike the previous chart, the vast majority of NATO members are above that line, and in fact there are only 4 countries that invested less than 20% of their defence expenditure into equipment in 2022. And interestingly, those 4 nations were Germany at 19.9%, Belgium at 19.3%, Canada at 18.8%, and Portugal at 17.9%. And on the far left-hand side of this chart, you can see that the countries that invested the most, the biggest percentage of their defence expenditure, were Hungary at 48%, Greece at 45%, Luxembourg at 39%, and Poland at 36%. And the other 2 countries that I think are worth noting are the United Kingdom, who invested 28%, and the United States, who invested 27%. And this chart brings the two charts that we've just looked at together. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the percentage of defence expenditure being invested into equipment. So it goes from 0% at the bottom to 55% at the top. And across the bottom, we've got the percentage of GDP being invested into defence expenditure, going from 0 on the left-hand side to 4% at the right-hand side. And the two red lines that we looked at in the previous charts are both plotted here. The vertical line shows the 2% of GDP guideline, and the horizontal line shows the 20% of defence expenditure into equipment. So effectively what we've got here is a grid that's now split into 4 different segments. In the top right-hand corner, we've got those countries that are both above the 2% GDP guideline and also above the 20% equipment guideline, and there are 7 countries sitting in that segment. Interestingly, the country that scored the highest on both metrics is Greece, and the other 6 countries are the United States, Poland, Lithuania, the UK, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, the segment in the top left-hand corner here shows all of those countries that are above the 20% equipment guideline but are below the 2% GDP guideline. And you can see this is where the majority of countries in NATO are clustered. And if we look at the bottom left segment, these are all of the countries that are both below the 2% GDP guideline and also the 20% equipment guideline. And in that segment, we've got 3 countries, Belgium, Canada, and Portugal. And there are also 2 on the borderline, which are Germany and Albania. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what Donald Trump said in his recent rally was really interesting. When we talk about NATO, I think we all take for granted the fact that all the member countries have signed up and they are compliant with the terms and conditions of whatever NATO have said they need to do in order to keep their membership alive. But what Donald Trump has revealed as part of his speech is that back when he was president, some of those member nations actually hadn't been contributing the amount of cash that they needed to as part of their obligation. And of course, what he raised in his speech was the concept of non-payment, meaning that your membership lapses, and therefore, if you were invaded by Russia, you could be in a very difficult situation if NATO turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, you haven't been keeping up with your subscriptions, you're overdue, and therefore you're no longer a valid member, and we're not going to come along and support you against Russia. Now, that is obviously quite a controversial statement to be making. Donald Trump isn't afraid of making controversial statements, obviously, but I think it does raise a really interesting question in terms of how much it costs to actually keep NATO funded. And in today's video, I wanted to go through some of those details. As I discussed right at the start of today's video, NATO is an alliance. So basically, it doesn't have any of its own forces. NATO isn't a mercenary group of forces that can be shipped in to save the day. It's actually needing people to send all of their own forces and equipment and form an alliance together to be able to defend anybody that it sees needs help. So that's how it's basically structured. And in order to make sure that NATO has enough forces that it can call upon, it needs all of the member states to be investing into its own military. So what we've seen in today's video is that all of those countries are required to invest around 2% of GDP, and of that expenditure, NATO also wants around 20% being invested directly into equipment to make sure that they've got enough planes and guns and tanks in the event that it was needed. And what we've seen from today's data is that a lot of countries are lapsing behind in terms of where they should be on that expenditure. The 2% GDP level has only been met by 7 countries in 2022. So that means that the vast majority, 23 out of 30, haven't been making that sort of investment. And that's got to be worrying from NATO's perspective, because 2% of GDP is relatively low. As we saw, the USA have been investing around 3.5%, so significantly more than 2%. And the fact that a lot of countries are falling behind in terms of that investment is a concern, because what it means is that a lot of their equipment will be going out of date. If you're not constantly updating and making sure that you've got the latest technology, you can be left behind in terms of actual warfare. And within the expenditure, 20% is recommended to be spent on equipment. Now, as we saw from the data, there's actually been a huge increase in the percentage of the GDP being spent on equipment. So countries are buying more hardware, so they've got lots of things in reserve. But it doesn't matter if you're spending a bigger percentage if your actual amount being invested into defence is going down. So percentages can be misleading. You can spend 100% of your defence expenditure on equipment, but if you've cut your expenditure down by half or even more, then overall it might mean that you're actually investing less into defence equipment than you were this time 10 years ago. So you have to be careful when you're looking at percentages. You also need to look at what that means in real money terms. But in terms of the overall summary of today's video, NATO is an expensive operation to keep running. It's costing around $3 billion per year, and all of the different countries all contribute different percentages. And as we saw, the USA, Germany, UK and France are the 4 biggest contributors, and they are keeping all of their payments up to date. But lots of the other member states are potentially not making those payments. And this throws open that question as to what do you do if somebody isn't up to date with their subscriptions? Will you keep that support going, or do you turn around and say, I'm really sorry, but you haven't paid your dues, and therefore we're not going to send any tanks and guns in to protect you? Now, all of this may well be academic, because if you've been following the channel, you'll know that President Putin came out recently and said in his interview with Carlson Tucker that he wasn't intending to invade any other countries. However, he did say that about Ukraine about 2 years ago also. So whether or not it ever happens remains to be seen. Whether or not NATO will support countries that haven't been paying their obligations is a really big question. And I wanted to post this video today really just to put you in the picture, to show you how much money's involved, which countries are involved, who's not been keeping up to date with their obligations, and therefore potentially could be at risk if something happened. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.
Hmm.